We are very excited to welcome Dr. Ford back. So he is an award-winning educator and consultant on the issues of equity in education, principal consultant at Filling the Gap, and executive director of the Center for Racial Equity in Education, CREED. He was appointed by Governor Cooper in North Carolina to serve as a member of the North Carolina State Board of Education, and he was also the 2014-2015 North Carolina Teacher of the Year. He has a bachelor's of science from Illinois State University and a master's in teaching from Rockford University. And I believe you've completed your PhD because I believe you're now Dr. Ford. Uh, so he has a master's in education, in urban education. And without further ado, I'm going to spotlight you.
All right. Thank you for that introduction. And can you all see this? Is everything working correctly? All right. Well, I'm going to time myself because as I've stated before, I can get a little bit long-winded, anybody who knows me. And so I'm going to try to adhere to the 40 minutes that I have allotted. Um, Thank you so much to the Red Wine and Blue crew for having me back anytime I get re-invited. It's a bonus. And so it was a pleasure coming here last time. And I really appreciate you ladies for the work that you're doing. It couldn't be more relevant, couldn't be more timely. So thank you and keep up the hard work. As the title suggests, I'm going to be talking today about um, race, and specifically how race has shaped the education system. I'm going to be doing a bit of a look, a crash course, if you will, on then and talking about the past, the evolution of race, giving a little bit of a lead up to how race has been at the center of a lot of what's taking place at present. And frankly, talking about the context of now and how we go forward and recommendations for resistance. I'll preface by saying that just a bit of personal disclosure. I am an unaffiliated person politically. And Creed is a nonpartisan organization. I say that because, I'm going to be providing policy analysis that is critical of the entire, political spectrum. And so, I know we don't like to engage in nuance in these times, and it can be, hyper polar, but that's, I'm, as to paraphrase Malcolm X, I'm for, right who, no matter who says it, I'm for truth, no matter who says it. And so that's the zeitgeist and the paradigm that I'll be using today. Without further ado, I want to lead in with kind of a framing for discussion here. In true teacher fashion, I'm going to borrow a motif that I used to use in the classroom. And that is, as a former history teacher, I used to tell my students that history is actually not a line, despite the fact that it's often taught in a linear fashion. When we actually think about it, when we start to see the patterns and we start to see the rhymes in history, we start to notice that actually history is more likened to a circle or a cycle, if you will. The same things, the same phenomena keep occurring, oftentimes the same issues, maybe with different people groups, different time periods, different land masses, but it just happens over and over again. So the gift that history gives us is that if we're attentive, we can draw out the lessons from history with the understanding that they are perhaps the best predictor of the future and be ahead of the curve when those things come along. I think that's important, additionally, because uh, I want to actually use some imagery. I don't know who else in the audience, but you all may recognize this rap group. I'm from the hip hop era, and so I always, whenever I can, try to pay homage to that. But this is a rap group from the late 1980s and the early 1990s known as Public Enemy. Public Enemy, which was a platinum selling rap group, but known for their highly political content, very, very strong kind of black nationalist bend. But they had a character, a group member by the name of Flavor Flav. Some of you all may know Flavor Flav. And Flav kind of was the perfect mix for the strong and unapologetic political stance of the group because he brought a bit of levity, kind of a court jester character. But Flav is most known for this particular piece of his decor. He would wear a clock around his neck all the time. People were like, "What's the deal with this clock?" And whereas it seemed like a silly thing to do, it actually had real symbolism. Flav wore this clock not to represent what we typically use clocks for, which is to tell us the literal time of day. For Flav, he also was letting people know that he also was engaged politically because this clock represented what time it was in terms of the moment, what season that we were in, socially and politically, what was really going on, that he was in tune, to use a modern euphemism, that he was woke. And so I want us to think about that because, and I'll lead in with this quote from the luminary Afrocentric scholar, John Heinrich Clarke. He says that history is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. It is a compass they use to find themselves on the map of human geography. It tells them where they are, but more importantly, what they must be. It tells them where they are, but more importantly, what they must be. And I hope that as I go through this slide presentation, that we ask ourselves, we hang that in our heart and in our head and ask ourselves what we must be in this moment. So let's look backwards briefly, and I'll give a kind of a crash course, brief history of race and education. And in all my trainings, I usually give like a really deep dive, but given the constraints of time, I'll give you the abbreviated version. I typically go into the history of when race as a social construct is first introduced in Western Europe. And I quote many of the, known and not so well known philosophers who first sort of codified it. But, I'll just throw a couple out there and zip through it. But one that may be of noteworthy is Voltaire, a French philosopher who existed and lived from the late 1600s into the mid to late 1700s. And Voltaire is known as an Enlightenment philosopher who had a lot to do with influencing what are now considered liberal democratic governments, right? And so he introduces the concept that all men are brothers under God. And that language mirrors the language in our founding documents of all men being created equal. The thing about Voltaire, though, is that he also was, again, engaging in nuance, an exceptional categorical racist, and that he did not believe that all men were even men. He believed in different races and that these races were organized around a hierarchy. And you can see in one of his quotes here, which I'll read briefly, he says, and writes rather, it is a serious question among them being Europeans, whether the Africans are descended from monkeys or whether the monkeys come from them. Our wise men, again, Europeans, have said that man was created in the image of God. Now, here's a lovely image of the divine maker, being facetious: a flat and black nose with little or hardly any intelligence. A time will doubtless come when these animals will know how to cultivate the land well, beautify their houses and gardens, and know the path of the stars. One needs time for everything. What strikes me about this quote is that here Voltaire is regarded as an Enlightenment philosopher, hugely influential, which he is, and yet he also, in a little known aspect of his philosophies, holds to this notion of the inherent superiority of white or European men's and the inherent intellectual inferiority of Africans or black people. And that's a common thread that we're going to see that gets reanimated throughout history and inspires the relationship with education and race, particularly as it involves black people. Um, so that was Voltaire. He's French. He has nothing to do with us, right? Let's talk about our folks, right? Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers of the nation, third president of the United States, the early 1800s. And Thomas Jefferson, another complex character. We see in his writings, the Notes on the State of Virginia, which he wrote prior to becoming president, is also revealing his thoughts around this concept of race. And he says, I advance it therefore as a suspicion only. So he's saying it's just a theory. I'm not stating as a fact that the blacks, whether originally or distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstance, are inferior to the whites in the endowment of both the body and the most important part here, and the mind. So this consistent theme, this contagion of the myth of racial superiority is spread from the early Enlightenment philosophers, and now we see it creeping into the worldview of the founders of the country and some of the earliest heroes. Thomas Jefferson, of course, was one of the earliest proponents of public education. He believed that all free people should have access to education. And so this doesn't wipe out the good ideas that he offered. It doesn't wipe out his accomplishments. But I think, whereas whether he's good or bad in those extremes, we can't engage in that. Well, I won't be engaging in that. But hopefully we can agree that this is categorically racist. Um, this is interesting to me too, because when we're kind of working on a timeline here. So we go from the early 1800s and now we go to mid 1800s, 1861 to 1865, when the Confederate States of America break away from the United States of America and form their own government. And whereas there's lots of debates about why that is, here we have the vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander H. Stephens, who is quoted as saying, as a race, the African is inferior to the white man. Subordination to the white man is his normal condition. He is not his equal by nature and cannot be made so by human laws or human institutions. Our system, therefore, so far as regards this inferior race, rests upon the great immutable law of nature. Rest upon this great immutable law of nature. And what he's referring to essentially is the idea of white supremacy and consequently black inferiority. One might say, what's the point of putting this up here? But I mean, it's a matter of debate, even as we teach history, whether this was even an animating feature of the political ideology of the Confederates. But here we see him speaking for himself. And furthermore, the inventor of, or the creator of the Confederate flag echoes the very same sentiment. Um, so William T. Thompson, the designer of the Confederate flag, says, as a people, we are fighting to maintain the heaven ordained supremacy of the white man over the inferior or colored race. As a national emblem, it being the Confederate flag is significant of our higher cause and the cause of a superior race. So, um, history, not get engaging in debate. I'm just going to provide individuals with the facts and they can argue with those. But it's important to recognize the notion of intellectual and really inherent inferiority of black people and the superiority of white people is a huge part of both the philosophies inspiring the founding of the Americas, the founding of the America, and even as it works through the evolution of abolishing slavery. It's still there. Coming out of slavery is a 12-year period known as Reconstruction. And for those who maybe haven't brushed up on the history lesson, this is probably one of the most instructive periods in the United States history in terms of race. It's what W.E.B. Du Bois refers to as the 12 years in the sun that Black people had immediately after emancipation. So after centuries of subjugation and legalized chattel and perpetual slavery, Black people are emancipated. And as a result of the Civil War, and there are three civil rights amendments that are adopted. The 13th Amendment, of course, outlaws slavery with as a punishment, slavery with the exception to being as a punishment for crime, which is a huge caveat. The 14th Amendment, which of course is birthright citizenship, which has thrust back into the conversation as of late. And then the 15th Amendment was the right to vote, at least on paper, but not enforced. This becomes hugely important because emancipation and these amendments give political enfranchisement to African American men. And these black men in that 12-year period go from being, imagine this, for centuries enslaved. It was against the law for many of them to read. They did it anyway, found ways to steal learning. And immediately upon gaining political enfranchisement, they run and they become elected. They get appointed to, well, not appointed, they assume elected office. Elected office both in the United States Congress, which these are the earliest black congressmen, and the state houses, the state legislatures and assemblies all throughout the former Confederate states. And it's important because one of the first things that these black men do when they get to these institutions of power is, especially in the southern states, they begin to rewrite these constitutions during the Reconstruction period, and they immediately seize upon the enshrining of the right to education, public education, as a key feature. Black men, in tandem with carpetbagging whites who tended to be liberal leaning whites from the North, come together and establish and encode the first true public education system in the United States of America and certainly throughout the South. And so that's important to understand as we talk about the relationship between race and education, is that these men use their immediate political enfranchisement to seize upon the ability to learn because they understood the power of that institution and knew that it was the greatest opportunity for them to mobilize themselves upward as well as their communities. Black education remains a matter of debate, however, for the next several years. The legendary ideological battle between as I mentioned, sociologist, one of the first black men to receive a PhD in the United States of America, W.E.B. Du Bois, versus formerly enslaved individual Booker T. Washington, who works himself through the ranks to become one of the most beloved figures and instrumental figures in education. And they have competing philosophies about what type of education black people should be receiving. W.E.B. Du Bois believed that political and civil rights, as well as a liberal education that exposes black people to a well-rounded, um, body of learning is foundational. It's necessary for grooming political leadership, for developing thinkers who can lead the race. And Booker T. Washington has a much more pragmatic outlook. He is more in favor of industrial education. He believes that black people need to be taught at that point in time to just figure out how to get a trade to be able to make a living for themselves, and that political rights will come about later on. But for right now, as he discusses in his Atlanta exposition speech, they need to cast down their bucket where they are. Now, the truth is there's much more overlap and similarity between their philosophies, and the answer is probably both then and today, a synthesis of both. But I put them up here to show that black education, as a collection or as a canon, is highly contested, even amongst black people. There's not an agreement, and there's diversity in terms of what should be taught and how it should be taught and for what purpose, be it more industrial, be it more political. And I have to pause here, whereas I focus most of my comments thus far on African Americans. When we talk about the relationship between race and education, one can't deny the impact that schools had on changing, um, communities within the Native American population of this country. The natives, of course, being the indigenous peoples of what now become the United States of America. But around the same period, around the mid 1860s, began what are called residential boarding schools, which really is kind of a misnomer because they really were indoctrination camps. Um, Education used as a tool of propaganda. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, as well as many Christian churches. So you talk about Christian nationalism, were stripping Native Americans of their cultural identity. These schools were developed for the purpose of assimilation. And so hundreds of thousands of Native Americans were taken from their homes, separated from their families, and put into these boarding schools that were rampant with abuse, rampant with the denial and cultural genocide of the folks. And again, the animating philosophy of these schools was Americanization. And I want us to hold that in our mind as well, thinking about what does that even mean? But essentially, it equated to kill the Indian in him and save the man. And so that's a very, very scary foreshadowing when we think of who is kind of behind the patriotic education admiration movement today, as well as the rise of Christian nationalism. Not segregation, but the Reconstruction period, as I mentioned, was brief. Some of the greatest Black accomplishments took place during that period, but it was under the protection of the federal government and the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Hayes-Tilden Compromise effectively ends this and begins the period of white backlash. And so in 1877 is a presidential election. At the time, as you might imagine, Black people are voting, and Hayes and Tilden in the race, it's contested that the presidential race was stolen, that there's corruption, that they stole the election. So again, this is just not. I laugh sometimes when I look at history rhyming because we've seen this before, and so you know they reach a compromise because they're fearful that this powder keg will blow up. And so ultimately, Hayes and Tilden come to an agreement that Hayes will take the presidency, but as part of that compromise, federal troops and the Federal Freedmen's Bureau needs to be removed from the South. So it's a concession for the Democrats. And what that does is it leaves Black people who've only been free for 12 years open to vigilante violence, lynchings, the fomenting of the KKK. And much of what inspired this was this notion of the idea that the federal government was unduly helping and assisting Black people. that they were oppressing white people in the process throughout the South by offering them services, by allowing them and giving them the opportunity to get on their feet. And so that again sounds kind of very much like a foreshadowing of where we're at right now. And so it begins the period of segregation, the white supremacist backlash, where violent white supremacists take back over the state houses, things like poll taxes, grandfather taxes, and voter suppression comes into the fore. And so black people use this right to vote that was allegedly secured for them in the 15th Amendment. And so that period of segregation lasts pretty much up until um, Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. The reason why I have this up here is because Brown v. Board, while ostensibly a education Supreme Court case and ruling, um, it reverberates to every other sector of the United States. So it strikes down the Plessy v. Ferguson separate but equal doctrine, which was a lie, right? A wink, wink, nod that everybody knew, but it began in education, but it didn't stay in education. It literally brought us probably the closest we've been to actualizing outside of the Reconstruction period multiracial democracy. And so it struck fear in the heart of a lot of people who had been really wrapping their identities up in this idea of white supremacy. And so, it's a dangerous, ideology. But at the end of the day, Brown versus Board of Education really put a big dent in that the momentum that had been gained for nearly 100 years. Out of that comes the civil rights legislation as well. And you know, it's you look at this as a movement, right? So Brown v. Board of Education is there's two of them, Brown 1 and Brown 2, 54 and 55. And then for about a 10-year period, nothing really happens in the United States of America. The 1964 Civil Rights Act is signed by Lyndon B. Johnson, which comes as a result of, lots of movement from, all the leaders we can think of. It is, it happens, but that's almost 10 years later, right? 1964. Well, actually 10 years later. And it prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, and sex, national origin in public places, employment, and federally funded programs. This is important. The reason I highlight it is because it's also being used at present as the basis for rolling back a lot of the things that were intended to uh, protect historically marginalized groups. Additionally, people don't tend to think about it this way, but the civil rights was a package of legislations, and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which is now known as the Every Student Succeeds Act, that gets renewed every few years, also comes out of this. This is civil rights legislation, so this is where you get Title I, Title IX funding from, right? And so this is important to note that these are key civil rights victories from that period. Okay, so now to the 2000s. I'm going to condense this and I'm going to turn the corner here. I can't begin to talk about where we're up, this build up to the cultural change that's taking place without talking about 2008 with the election of Barack Obama. Feel about him however you may, and that's allowed, that's invited, right? This was a symbolic victory on any number of fronts. He was the first black man to be elected as president of the United States, and that, by any measure, is significant. But it did cause, once again, a cultural backlash. A year later, in 2009, we have the development of what becomes known as the Tea Party movement, which ostensibly comes about as a resistance to federal taxation and wasteful spending, um, but quickly devolves into some very racist and xenophobic ideas. And out of this grows the idea of birtherism, questioning whether former President Barack Obama was even eligible to be elected as a United States president, and questioning his origin of birth. Um, Not long after that, 2012, you have the vigilante murder of a young Trayvon Martin, who's walking home from school with a pack of Skittles and Arizona iced tea by George Zimmerman, who is self-deputized himself as a neighborhood watch person. And his failure to be prosecuted sent shockwaves through the nation. I was in the classroom at this time, and I can tell you, to young 15, 16, 17-year-olds, this shook them at their core. It woke them up. And it's largely pointed to as the official beginning of what becomes the Black Lives Matter movement. But then also popular culture starts to change. You start to see more radical images, pro-black images that show up in mainstream. So Beyonce's 2013 Super Bowl performance, relatively, in my perspective, benign performance, but to see black women of different hues dressed in black berets, it was kind of an homage to the Black Panther Party movement of the late 60s and 1970s. And this caused a backlash, a freak out amongst some populations within the country. 2014, Michael Brown is killed in a suburb of St. Louis. And as a part of that, the critique of these young men being killed at the hands of law enforcement and vigilantes, um, journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones does an excellent piece where she exposes the segregation that exists in the area that Michael Brown grew up in the schools. Um, and of course, we know her as well from the work on the 1619 project later on. But then also in 2015, you had the murder perpetrated by a white supremacist teenager named Dylan Roof, who kills 9 black parishioners at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, who himself was inspired by the Confederacy. You see there the flag, but in his manifesto, he cites schools as part of his animating reason. He says that the school composition and that wealthy whites moving out and going to better schools was a proxy for white schools, and that it left poor whites to have to go to school with undesirables. And then lastly, Colin Kaepernick's kneeling, which takes place in 2016, I want to say. And so this is just a listen, this is my arbitrary analysis, but if I'm taking you back and you remember these moments, you can kind of see how everything was starting to cascade into a really fraught cultural moment that was happening. And people sensed, and they were right, that something was changing in the United States of America. But 2020 remains the place and remains the period, I think, that really encapsulates when things really started to change. Some people call it the summer of Black Lives. You all remember it. COVID had just hit. We were quarantined, lots of debate about vaccines and masking orders. And in the midst of that, there are, 2 police killings and 1 vigilante white killing. And most all of them were caught on video, with the exception to Breonna Taylor. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. And something happened. Something occurred. There was an awakening that took place with folks of all hues all across the country. And as a result of that, people risked life and limb with this communicable virus to go out and protest. And as a result of that, the desire and the hunger for more understanding was occurring. There are books from Dr. Ibram Kendi flying off the shelf. Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility flying off the shelf, and furthermore, this was an international movement. So you had protests in the streets of people showing solidarity in Paris, France, and the UK, and in Amsterdam, and Australia, and corners, backward areas, even of the United States. It was an interesting period to be alive, and it symbolized a shift in the consciousness of the country. And then 2021 happened. After life resumed kind of back to normal, this pattern of advancement and backlash held to form. And in 2021, out of nowhere, seemingly, there is this so-called anti-CRT movement. A certain faction of the population discovers what they consider to be critical race theory and assumes that incorporation of any perspectives that don't fit the dominant narrative, that talk about racism, that talk about sex, that talk about gender, that talk about historically marginalized groups are CRT and should be banned from books. The laws passed laws proposed in state houses to prevent or severely limit how history is taught starts to take place all across the country. And it was everywhere. We remember it. We were there. Creed, my organization, was in the thick of it. And we were asking ourselves, what just happened? I've told you all the last time I was here that there's a history toward this, right? Behind this, that Carter G. Woodson, largely considered the father of Black history, who gives us Negro History Week and eventually Black History Month, that he was asking and advocating for the inclusion of Black histories as early as the 1920s. And that even during that period, you had the United Daughters of the Confederacy who were using schools and targeting school districts and textbooks, who, if they found anything objectionable to this noble lost cause, were mobilizing themselves and were pretty successful in using education and schools as a way to propagate this myth and this lie about the lost noble cause of the Confederacy. And I talked about the eventual probably adoption of great replacement theory or white replacement theory that really looked at the demographic shifts in the nation and started to create animus and started to create um, anger and grievance against non-white populations. And so now we have to ask the question of where we are. And rather than answer it, I just want you to read this definition and tell me if you think it fits. Fascism is a political philosophy or movement or regime such as that of the fascisti that exalts nation and often race above the individual and that stands for autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader, severe economic and social regimentation, and forcible suppression of opposition. This is a tweet from our president, Donald Trump, just last week. He says, he who saves his country does not violate the law. And I have to confess that in the last week, I've seen more Nazi salutes than I have probably through the whole of my entire life. I've read about these things in my history books. I know that they occurred, but the casual normalization of Nazism, primarily perpetrated by the individual on the upper left-hand corner, who now is the richest man in the world and heads a department called the Department of Government Efficiency, or Dodge, and has committed himself to laying off federal workers and dismantling the Department of Education. So I will allow you to determine for yourself whether this meets the definition of fascism. But what I wanted to draw is that there's all these things are related. Different animations, parents' bill of rights, school vouchers, anti-DEI. We're blaming DEI for everything now. The memory laws, the anti-affirmative action, the anti-CRT efforts, the book bans, they're all related. These things are not separate and apart. They are part and connected to a movement that is now that began from a moment and it's now that has now created momentum and furthermore has really gained institutional power. We know about the executive orders that have come down. We know that schools are now no longer safe places for our immigrant students, our undocumented students. And I said I'm going to be fair. And so I want to be fair here because it'd be great if this were simply about reds and blues and good guys and bad guys. But we need to pay. We need to note here that both the both the Biden administration and the Obama administration had higher rates of deportation than the Trump administration. Why is that important? Is because if we're going to be principled in our arguments, we need to make sure that we are maintaining integrity and fidelity with our positions. Fortune 500 companies are walking back DEI. And listen, school vouchers are wreaking havoc and redirecting monies from the public coffers to private schools. I said last time when I came here that if you want to know why is there a lack of commitment to funding public goods, things like public education? I want you to think about the worst stereotypes of education and how schools look in the economically developing world. Think about Africa, think about Asia, think about the Latin American context, and think about how in those countries you don't have a strong public apparatus. Everybody doesn't get to go to school for free. That you often have private schools, and if you don't have the money to pay for those schools, or those public schools, what they refer to as government schools, that you might end up without education whatsoever, and that the private schools are reserved for only the most wealthy, only the most fortunate, only those with the greatest resources. And if you can picture what the rest of the economically developing world looks like, I want to posit to you that that's what they're intending to do here in the United States of America. The grand scheme, where are we headed? At this point, I'm happy that everybody's kind of galvanized and has name recognition of this initiative from the Heritage Foundation. And when we look at the agenda, the educational agenda that was proposed in this document, there's several concerning planks. Abolishing of the Department of Education. We're witnessing that, correct? Eliminating of Title I funding, terminating the promoting school choice, restructuring student loan programs, and discouraging DEI initiatives. When we look at this, the short list of things, I think it's fair to say that this is becoming a reality through executive order. Now, to be very clear, these things are being challenged in court, and I think that that's a good thing. But make no mistake, this is the agenda that's being played and it's being rolled out, the playbook rather. And before I turn the corner and close on how we move forward and what we do now, I'd be remiss, you all, if I didn't take a moment to talk about how we got here. Because I think it's a fool's errand. I think it's a crucial mistake to not look at the error of our ways and not talk about the things that we have done, we being collectively in the nation, the areas we failed to prevent this from occurring. Um, and I think there are several contributing factors. I think one is the failure to catalyze a political moment into real policy change. I think we had a moment. I talked about the cultural cascade that took place. And, what we got out of that was a lot of symbolism. We got a lot of commitments from Fortune 500 companies to contribute, adopting equity statements. And we got a lot of, in some cases, DEI officers. But politically, we didn't see anything tangible to really speak of that really mirrored what was happening societally. And I think that was a grave error. I think it was a tremendous mistake. And I think it causes us, it should give us pause or cause us to begin to really develop better policy chops and not be so easily swayed by symbolism. And I also want to say that fear mongering as a part of that was a causal factor because a lot of what we got was what the other side was going to do or what somebody else perhaps could do. And while it may be true, it wasn't motivating enough to really create the sort of change I think we were looking for. Lack of accountability for bad actors. There were a lot of individuals, both elected officials and otherwise, who did a lot of bad things. And it is an American pattern to when you have individuals who participate in these backlashes. Even I think about the 10% plan that Lincoln endorsed after the Civil War, where only 1/10 of the Southern population had to denounce their allegiance to the Confederacy to be welcomed back into the Union. That's extremely generous. And I think that you're planting seeds of fascist rebellion, racist rebellion, when you when we don't hold people accountable, or when we prioritize getting along, or the politics of respectability over really the prosperity of the nation, and then frankly complicity. Like I said, it'd be nice if it was one side or the other side, but when we talk about the privatization of schools, but of other common goods, that has been a bipartisan effort. That is that both parties, as it were, have been complicit in perpetuating that. And corruption, there's been an outsized influence from industries, influence legislation that otherwise would benefit folks, and censorship. Different modalities of learning and free speech. One can look at the banning of TikTok, or even the response from the Biden administration to campus protests in light of what's happening in Gaza. It simply cannot be overstated how much that these things contributed, I think, to the environment that we're in. And then lastly, the effectiveness of what I call the Rufo strategy, which was created by Christopher Rufo, who is largely kind of seen as the guy who created the strategy for the recent culture war that's taken place and his targeting of the left. Christopher Rufo, whereas he's not the brainchild, but I think the animating figure who was on social media narrating this anti-CRT movement and what steps were going to be done in real time and what was going to happen next. And it was occurring. And he's been generous enough to, in interviews, not only narrate step by step the choreography of this movement, but to tell you the steps. And in a political the news outlet, journalistic outlet last year, or the year before, he talked about a strategy. He talked about focusing on narrative, the storytelling component, and making sure media was on board with perpetuating and engaging in this cultural discourse. That was a huge part of it. And that once he had the narrative strategy, it was about finding financing, not only funding for getting more stories out there, but economic consequences, economic strategies, for punishing individuals who were found to be in violation, found to be doing woke things, found to be promoting DEI, which was a catch-all phrase for anything that involved folks of color or folks who didn't adhere to traditional gender norms. Political strategy. Once individuals who were in elected office who had the capacity to enact power structures to put forth these things were on board, it was just a matter of time. But the thing he didn't mention as one of his planks, but that he mentions in the story is centrist liberalism. And I'm not picking on my centrist liberal friends here, but he mentions them as a major cog in the wheel, the ideological positioning of moderation. And he says in this quote, he says, once my position, which began on the right, of the political spectrum became the dominant position across the center left, I knew that it was just a matter of time before we were going to be successful. And so I think it's important to note here that Rufo targeted very deliberately the center left of the political spectrum, knowing that if he could get them to participate in this campaign, there was just a matter of time before they capitulated to the demands of the extreme right. And for those who don't know where that is on the political spectrum, that's around here. And I think it's fair to say that if you look at this political spectrum, if you stretch it further to the right, it becomes much more difficult to maintain centrism without also moving the center to the right as well. And so, we got a lot of symbolism out of those moments. I recall seeing folks kneeling down after George Floyd with kente cloths on, and I also recall them not putting forth any policy with any teeth around police reform. I recall the lack of accountability for individuals who had been guilty of corruption. And even in our current situation, I see a lot of giving up of leverage, a lot of capitulating to demands. And so, as we talk about our recommendations that I'm about to close for resistance and answering that fundamental question of who we must be, I think we got to learn those lessons and be honest with ourselves about how to move forward. I think the number one step, and I'm going to give you four and then I'll get out of here, is to develop better politics. Now, what do I mean by that? I'm going to use education since that's what I'm here to talk about. But I really think we need to start thinking outside of the political binary as it concerns party and really focus on the issues. I think we really need to look beyond the present American political apparatus. I think I'm personally not, I don't have an affinity for party loyalty. I'm an issues guy. And for me, it's policy over party all day long. And so it might be just uncomfortable for us and it might be a new muscle that we have to use, but begin figuring out where you stand on these educational issues. How do you feel about universal access to education? And really write that down. What are your positions? How do you feel about student debt relief and loan forgiveness? How do you feel about teacher pay and labor rights? How do you feel about school equity and racial justice in education? How do you feel about ECE and childcare? How do you feel about school safety and gun reform? How do you feel about LGBTQ and gender inclusive policies in school? And once you have codified what your personal politics are on those things, you start looking for the individuals that have the politics that match your positions. And if you cannot find those individuals, or if they're not found in parties, I think it might be time for us to start finding individuals who can run absent or agnostic to political party. Second thing is don't get distracted. Um, I think a lot of the function of the constant executive orders and the news articles and the streaming, and the headlines that burst onto our timeline on social media is to overwhelm us. It is to dysregulate us. It is to distract us. It is to discombobulate us and to stupefy us. And I want to encourage us not to do that. I want to encourage us to take care of ourselves, to find joy, to find vitality, to find community, to make memories with people, to enjoy ourselves in this moment because it is designed to overwhelm us. It is designed to keep us in a constant state of distraction whereby we can't remain focused, whereby our energy is dissipated and we are exhausted. It is very much psychological in the manner of warfare. And it's important for us to keep the main thing the main thing. There will be plenty for us to be outraged about. But I think figuring out our locus of control and figuring out ways to meter and pace ourselves so that we can really preserve our energy for the ways that we can actually enact change will be crucial in this environment. Unironically, I know Tim is going to be coming and speaking to you all soon, but I think it's time to break decorum. The notion of respectability politics and prioritizing civility and the norms, uh, I think those things are literally the string and tape that are holding together the republic at this point. And I don't think they're going to hold for much longer. Do not obey in advance. And of the 20 recommendations that Tim gives, there's just three I want to throw out here. It thrives on on people voluntarily complying. Tyranny does, and it's you have to figure out a way to be bold, to be courageous, to stand out. And that doesn't mean not to be scared, because courage and fear, they can occupy the same space. What courage does is it disallows us to be overcome by fear, to speak up even when our voice is shaky. And practicing corporal politics, showing up to meetings, to protests. Our physical presence is a matter of real resistance, and it's incumbent upon us to do that, to not be afraid of seeming out of order. But the norms ain't gonna save us. Now is not the time to be conforming. Now is the time for breaking decorum. And lastly, I'll say knowing your role. And the beauty of this is that everybody has one. I don't care who you are. Everybody's job is not to be on the front lines with a sign. Everybody's job is not to be, speaking up at board meetings, but it's for everyone. Think about how you vote. Find your voice, support organizations that do the work. And yes, I will make a shameless plug for our organization, Creed, because it's precisely in times like these that even our nonprofits, the funding landscape has changed dramatically. Not only of Fortune 500 companies backed away from this work, but so have foundations. And so a lot of our organizations are going to end up drying up as a result of this change in the atmosphere. And so supporting organizations that are doing the work is hugely important. I'll put a shameless plug to join the Public School Strong campaign, which is a national movement to organize around local school boards and push back against the regressive movement that got all of us in this place to begin with. If you're looking for more information, I'll share that in the chat. But I want to end by saying this. Whatever we do now is what we would have done then. What do I mean by that? A lot of us ask ourselves, man, I wonder what I would have done if, I was alive during slavery. I wonder what I would have done if I was alive during segregation. I wonder what I would have done during the civil rights movement, or, the emergence of the Nazi movement. We ask ourselves that. And the truth of the matter, as we contrast then and now, is that whatever we do now is what we would have done then. Look at Dr. Martin Luther King here, public polling on his popularity. We see from 63 to 67, King was not a popular figure. Now he appears to be universally beloved, but at the time that he was doing it, it was not convenient. It was not popular. It was not in vogue. It was not acceptable. And I want to leave you all with this quote from Dr. King, where he says, cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? And there comes a time when we must take a position that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but one must take it because it is right. I want to thank you all once again for taking the time and doing the work that's required of this moment.
Thank you so much. Lots of love in the chat. Everyone getting so much from the presentation. And I can't believe you were bringing up on tyranny, and Dr. Snyder is coming to speak next week. So perfect. Julie, I'll leave it to you here.
First things first, you mentioned memory laws, and some folks did put some definition into the chat, but can you define that for us?
Sure. Memory loss is kind of a catch-all term for all of the bills that were forwarded in from 2021 to 2023 that sought to eliminate things like divisive concepts. They call it divisive concept bills, or laws that literally govern how history is taught. It puts parameters around how history is taught. We often call them and Creed white comfort bills, because they would oftentimes speak about children should not be made to feel uncomfortable. And it's like, as a history teacher, unless you're a sociopath, if you have the capacity for empathy, while grappling with history, you're going to have all sorts of emotional responses. I hope that you would. But that's what we refer to when we say memory laws. It's laws that govern how we literally remember this nation and the world.
So if this is cyclical, then is there anything that we can do to prevent it from happening or to, fix it?
Yeah, and I mean, I thought long and hard about this, right? Because I know that folks are looking for kind of a playbook, quick and easy solutions. And one is I want to recommend Tim's book again, and I want to say there continued. Listen, um, I come from a heritage that was learning how to read. Excuse me, when it was punishable by 30 lashings from a whip.
Mhm,
And guess what? They did it anyway.
mhm,
They
mhm,
did it anyway. And so, to an extent, what I want to impress upon everybody is it is wildly arrogant and detached from reality for these individuals to think that they can legislate away, the desire and certainly the pursuit of this sort of knowledge.
mhm.
So I'm gonna say, be fugitive, be subversive. Um, and I'm gonna say, and I'm gonna go back to point number one. This is my personal. You're asking me on a personal level. We need to develop better politics because a lot of what could have been done, um, we're 2 to 3 years late on.
Mhm,
We are. And
mhm,
I think we got to be honest about that. We fell asleep at the wheel. We assumed the victories of the past were secure.
mhm.
That the norms would hold, that the dam wouldn't break, and that, our elected officials would do with the level of force and strength what we wanted them to do. And I think we've been wrong about that. And so, whatever happens from henceforth forward, we need to really be acute in what our politics are.
So there are, as you know, a lot of people out there that don't you believe that racism even still exists.
Sure.
I don't understand that, but they don't. So what are some of the things, what's the simplest thing that we can do to or say to someone who really just doesn't see it?
Yeah, yeah, it's not a problem. At this point, we have enough data, right? Like we have enough, like so. Yeah, I do have my PhD, my doctorate of philosophy in urban education, and you know, not only are there are data sets, really sophisticated statistical analyses and tools. But I mean, if for anybody, nobody should have to go back to grad school or anything to figure this stuff out. Just do basic searches of, you know, race and healthcare access,
Mhm,
race and, you know, housing,
mhm,
uh, race and uh, medical care, and you do these Google searches, maternal health, and like these are casual things that anybody can do. And if you look at
mhm,
these racialized patterns over and over again, and you say, "Well, that's pure coincidence," I have to say that's intellectually dishonest. And so, yeah, people debate about it. I don't, because I don't debate the undebatable.
mhm,
But if folks really are in good faith asking that question, they can use their Googles.
mhm. So since we are getting close on time, one of the things that someone asked are there any books that you recommend?
Yeah. Two books that I'm reading right now, because I think that they're at the crux of why we're not manifesting or actualizing what we have the potential to. I finished it, but I'm reading it again. It's The Sum of Us by
Mhm,
Heather McGee,
mhm,
and a text called Fear Itself by Ira Katz Nelson. And that documents the evolution of the New Deal in the United States of America. And I think that we have to begin to adopt the politics of our heroes. When we talk about FDR, or even folks like myself, when we talk about the Black Panther Party, or we talk about Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X, we have adopted and appreciated their work, their movement. But when you really analyze their politics, I go back to just focus on the issues, the things
mhm,
that they advocated for, FDR, and then the things he was trying to advocate for, the second, Bill of Rights, and
mhm,
Malcolm X and Dr. King, and even the Black Panther Party. A lot of these were the things that I think are going to move the needle for us. Consequently, let's be honest, they're also the things that are considered, radical left on the political spectrum. Just want to be
mhm,
honest about that. And so the question shouldn't be whether we consider ourselves here or there on the political spectrum. Again, what are your politics? Figure out what you really deeply believe and then plot that on a political spectrum and let the chips fall where they may.
Mhm. Mhm.
So those are two texts that I think will be really, really helpful.
Say the name of the second book again, please.
Fear Itself by
Okay.
Ira Katz Nelson.
Mhm.
And that talks about, I think the two of those together show why racism has prevented us from having a lot of common goods and things that otherwise would help us out, and why even in the midst of a need for a populist movement, if we don't wed race with populism, we'll just get a very xenophobic form of populism, which has happened in the past as well.
Mm. Okay. So we've got like a minute left. Anything that you want folks to know before we go?
Yeah. And I say this, I'm preaching to myself here, but um a lot of people are discouraged and a lot of people are obviously going to be hurt by this political moment. And that is a fact. I
Mhm.
don't want to deny that. But my radical imagination says that this is also a real opportunity. There are people who may not agree with us, who may um, come from different, your own individual points on the political spectrum. And I mean this individually because Creed doesn't have a political bend. But when they start to wake up, somebody has to be there to receive them.
Mhm.
And somebody has to be there not to point the finger and engage in short and fraud and say, that's what you get, but to say, yeah, develop empathy and say, you get it now. This is, yeah, I understand why you did what you did.
Mhm.
But now's the time to start figuring out on a human level how to truly model the multiracial, um, empathetic, interdependent society that we all belong to, whether we act like it or not.
Well, can't thank you enough. We need to have you back again, so I'm gonna put that plug in already.
A third time, unheard of.
Because this was invaluable. And folks are already clamoring for the recording, which if you didn't see in the notes, we do have a YouTube channel where this will be posted within a few days or so.
Awesome.
And with that, I'll
Awesome.
kick it back over to Julie.
I have nothing further to say. I think the love is in the chat, and we do appreciate everything that you shared tonight. So, everybody, come back next week and read Dr. Snyder's book. You can read it really quickly. I'm halfway through, so check it out. Come back and hear from him, and we hope to see you all soon. Thank you again so much, Dr. Ford. Good
Thank
night,
you.
everybody.
My pleasure.